Welcome to the United Leukodystrophy Foundation's 2021 Virtual Family Conference. Our session today at 2:30 p.m. is Rare Disease Clinical Trials, presented by Dr. Keith Van Haren and Angela Ponches. Go ahead, Angela. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Keely. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Ponches. I am the Senior Director of Patient Advocacy at Vigil Neuroscience, and just thrilled to be here today to talk to you all about clinical trials. And hopefully Dr. Van Haren will be able to join us shortly. So to begin, I will share my screen. Keely, are you able to see that?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So before I start talking about clinical trials and going into the details, sometimes I feel like we hear the words clinical trial and we look like this young girl who is like, what the heck are those? So what I'm hoping to do today is just go over the basics of clinical trials. What are they? What are the phases? And what should you expect as a participant? So before we go into the details of what clinical trials are and the different phases and what you can expect as a participant, let's just define what they are. So what a clinical trial is a research study that gathers information and data about an experimental or investigational drug. So what I mean by investigational is that it is not approved by the Food and Drug Administration for any type of marketing or sale. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the FDA for those of us in the US, but it's a very similar process in other regions by other regulatory bodies like the EMA and so on. So the other thing about clinical trials is that there are different types of clinical trials. There's observational clinical trials and interventional. And observational are basically clinical trials where they observe people in their normal settings. There's no type of study drug. It's really to kind of understand what the disease is like without any type of intervention. So a great example of an observational study is a natural history study. And we'll talk more about natural history studies a little bit later. And then interventional studies are those that actually have some sort of study drug that's being studied. And it basically is looking at seeing if the drug is safe and effective. And the purpose of clinical trials, again, is to really just collect quality data and information that we can use to know if the drug is safe and effective and can potentially treat a disease or condition. So I'm not going to go word by word on this slide, but I do want to kind of touch upon some common terms and words that you'll hear when you hear about clinical trials. So when someone's talking about a clinical trial, they may mention the word protocol. So that's really the plan that describes what is being studied, what's the question that we're asking, and how are we conducting the study to ensure that we're getting the data we want and that we're ensuring the safety of the patients who are participating in the study. And when I know I mentioned study drug previously, but again, that's the investigational drug that has not been approved yet that is being researched in the study. Sometimes you may hear the word placebo. Placebo is basically a pill or a liquid or some sort of intervention that looks like the drug that's being studied, but it actually doesn't have the active ingredients. And a great example is like if there is a study drug that's being studied that is a IV drug, then sometimes the placebo may be something like a saline, but it looks just like that study drug that's being studied. So as a participant or even as the study center, you may not even know what's in the liquid. And then that brings me to a control group. So basically this is the group that is not receiving any type of treatment study drug, and it's the group that's being used as the comparator. So there's a great example, like this group may be receiving placebo, or they may be receiving some other type of treatment, or they may be part of a natural history data cohort. And control groups are really important because you need some sort of comparison to say, if somebody did not receive the study drug, this is kind of what their disease progression looked like. And if someone did receive the study drug, in comparison to that control group, this is what their disease looked like after receiving the drug. Then you have the process of randomization, and that's basically if you have multiple types of treatments that are being studied in the research trial. So for example, if there is a placebo group and a study drug group, then a participant is randomized or assigned to one or the other. And that process is done in a random fashion. And it's just like if you flipped a coin, you would have a 50% chance of receiving the placebo or the active drug. And then a few other words, you may hear blinding. So when a placebo is involved or randomization is involved, it basically means that the participant and or the study team doesn't know what treatment that each participant is assigned to. And the purpose of this is to ensure that there's no type of bias, because let's just say if you knew that you were taking the study drug, then you're automatically going to kind of feel like, oh, I already feel so much better. I'm taking this drug and I know I'm getting better. But what we want to do is make sure that everyone is reporting information without any type of bias that they based on whether or not they're taking drug. So it's really for quality data. Then you have endpoints, and those are basically what is being used as a measurement to see if the drug is effective or not. So some endpoint examples include different types of imaging like MRIs. It may be some sort of movement scale. So some of you may be familiar with something called a 2-minute walk test, a 6-minute walk test, something that shows over time that you can measure at each study visit to see whether or not there's any type of effectiveness of the drug. Another term you might hear is standard of care, and that is basically a treatment that's widely accepted by medical experts as the treatment for the disease. So just a really good example, basic example is the standard of care for a headache is typically like Tylenol or ibuprofen. And then you have the study sponsor. So that is the group that basically funds the research and is ultimately responsible for it. And some examples of that may be the NIH, if it's a government funded study, or a privately funded study would be sponsored by like a pharmaceutical company. Okay, so now that we have some of these terms down, let's talk about the different phases of clinical trials, because you may hear about a phase 2 study that's enrolling, a phase 3 study that's enrolling, but what does that really mean? So when it comes to drug development, there's all these different phases of clinical research. Even before we do any type of research in the clinic, so in clinical trials, there's research that's being done in the lab or in animals. And that's the discovery and preclinical phase. That's where researchers find information about, is this drug, what kind of data can we collect about this drug? Is there any toxicities, any type of major side effects, even in animals, that we should know about? And this is where you collect all your information and come up with a hypothesis of why this study drug, based on the information you found in like cells and animals, means that you could potentially proceed into the clinic. And in the US, we take all that data and we submit it to the FDA in something called an investigational new drug application, an IND. And what happens is the FDA looks at all the information you've gathered from all the benchtop research in the cells and in the animals, and they let you know whether or not you can proceed in something into the clinic in humans. And then once they agree with that, then the sponsor can move forward in something called a phase 1 study. And the study drug is tested in a very small group of individuals in a phase 1 study. And typically, actually, in a phase 1 study, it's usually done in healthy volunteers. And it's very small number, very small dose. And really what you're trying to learn is, what are the side effects? What's the safety like? How is the body processing the drug? Once you collect that information, actually when the sponsor collects that information, they take that information and submit it again to the FDA along with a protocol for a phase 2 study. So a phase 2 study is a bit larger than a phase 1 study, and it is going to study the drug in patients. So those who have the disease that this treatment is being developed for. And in a phase 2 study, questions that are being answered is, again, is the drug safe? What type of dose should we be using? And just some basic information, early information about how well the drug is working. After a phase 2 study is done, you'll hear some repetition here. The sponsor has to take that data and submit that again to the FDA, and along with the protocol or that research plan for a phase 3 study. And a phase 3 study is much larger than a phase 2 study. It's basically the study that confirms that the drug is effective, that it's working well in treating this disease, that it's safe, and that the benefits outweigh any types of risks, so any type of side effects that are occurring from the drug. A phase 3 study is typically a bit longer, and again, more patients are participating in that study, because really that's one of the most important studies to tell you if the drug that is used to approve the drug or not. And then all this information from the preclinical data, the phase 1 data, the phase 2 and phase 3, that all gets submitted to the FDA again for a new drug application. That's where the sponsor is asking the FDA for approval of the drug for a treatment. And hopefully the drug works and it's approved. And even after that, there is more studying that needs to be done with the drug. So in a phase 4, a very large study, the sponsor is going to continue to learn about the long-term side effects, if the drug is still working well in patients, and that data is continued to be submitted to the FDA. So as you can see, there's a lot of oversight from the FDA and a lot of data that's required for a drug to get approved. Up here, you see that I've also listed a natural history study. And this is really important, especially in rare disease trials, because oftentimes we don't know as much about the disease because it's just being discovered maybe, or there just hasn't been a lot of information and data that's been collected before. Natural history studies typically occur in parallel with the other studies that are ongoing. Sometimes they may begin a little bit later in the process. So this isn't like the end-all be-all for all natural history studies, but the goal is to collect as much information as possible, because that can really support all the information that's being submitted to the FDA. If you recall the terms I talked about earlier, that natural history study could be potentially used as a control, as a comparator for the drug that's being studied versus just no drug at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So I've talked a lot about the FDA already, and one of the things I want to kind of go over is who has oversight of the research studies. So as I mentioned earlier, the FDA is quite involved in the oversight of the research trials, and they're really responsible for providing the guidelines for the research and ensuring that the research is done appropriately. And the study sponsor, who's ultimately responsible for the study, they're the ones who's writing the protocol or the study plan. They submit all the data to the FDA, and the FDA just continues to review that safety data, safety and efficacy data. In addition to that, from like each individual study center, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, there's another level of oversight, something called an institutional review board, or an IRB. And each study site has this kind of independent review board that ensures that even at their center, so at their hospital site or their clinic, that the research is being done according to guidelines, and that any type of safety information is collected, and that patient safety is being kept as a priority. Some studies may have another oversight group, a data safety monitoring board, or a DSMB, and that is a group that usually the study sponsor puts in place, and it's an independent group of experts who know the disease well, and they can help monitor the safety throughout the study. And then finally, another team has oversight and responsibility for the research, and that's the study doctor and their team. That's that individual who you're going to see all the time. You're going to see that team every time you come in for a visit, and they just monitor you and your participation throughout the entire study. So now that we've gone over the kind of basic terms, the phases, some of the oversight information, let's talk about like what goes into actual participation in a clinical trial. So before you participate, you have to find a trial that's nearby you, or even if it's not nearby you, you have to find one that has the trial open that you're interested in, and then you'll be able to get there, whether the company who's sponsoring the study will cover that travel. All of that information should be available to you. But what you'll do to find a study is there's a few different ways that you can do that. One is through patient advocacy groups and organizations like the ULF, or the disease-specific, leukodystrophy-specific groups that you're working with. So like Connect ALD or groups like that, and they'll probably have information about the different clinical trials available to you on their website. Your doctor, who's a specialist in the leukodystrophy that you're interested in, may also be participating in clinical research, or may know of other clinical trials that are occurring, and they could potentially tell you about them. You can do some research on your own. There's clinicaltrials.gov. So that's a website that basically the FDA requires sponsors, so those individuals responsible for the research, to post all of their studies on this website. And basically, sponsors are required to put the research before it's even begun, as the research is being conducted, and they have to provide updates. And then even when the study is complete, sponsors have to post the results of the study on this website. So you can find studies that are open and enrolling. If you're interested in one, you would basically put here in the condition or disease that you're interested in, the region you're in, and you can even go into the advanced search and enter city and state if you want to go even more detailed with your search. But there you can find all the studies that are nearby you and open, and then you can even find studies that have completed, and you can read about the results that they've had. And then you may also find some studies through different types of advertisements, the radio, newspaper, if people are still looking at newspapers, and potentially social media as well, through maybe the different patient groups that you're following. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There are different study sites that where clinical trials are conducted. So clinical trial study sites can be like at universities, clinics, hospitals, and they're really selected based on the doctor. So, the study sponsor wants to work with the expert who is experienced in the disease that's being studied and has experience in research, has a team who can support him or her in the research. And another really important thing about these clinical trial centers is that, ideally there's locations that are accessible to many patients. In rare disease, it's a little bit different because sometimes these experts, there's not a lot in comparison to more common diseases, but the study sponsors try their best to have as many locations as possible so that it's accessible to patients. So once you've found a clinical trial, a clinical center near you, or even if it's not near you, you have the means to travel because it's provided by the study sponsor. There's a lot to consider when you decide to participate or not. And there are burdens and risks. So that includes, it takes time to participate in a clinical trial. Some visits may be quite long because there's a lot of data that's being collected. And it can be a full day, or it can even be up to 2 days per visit. There's a lot of different types of samples that are being collected, whether it's like MRI imaging, blood samples, potentially cerebrospinal fluid through lumbar punctures. There's a lot of different things that you need to consider when you think about participating in a trial. There's other procedures that you may need to partake in. So whether it's a way of measuring how your disease is progressing. So it may be something like a cognitive test or some sort of motor test. Those are things that may be involved in when you participate in a clinical trial. I talked a little bit about travel. So you may need to travel to the clinical center if it's not nearby your home. You may need to fly or drive quite a bit. There's the risk of, it is an experimental treatment that's being studied. So there's risks for side effects that that no one may be aware of. And then even if you decide to participate, there may be a placebo. So you may receive placebo and not the experimental drug. So those are some things to consider. On the other hand, there's benefits to participating in a clinical trial. You may get additional care or time with the trial staff. You may have access to those newer and potentially beneficial treatments. And there's an altruistic factor here too. You may help increase disease understanding and potential future treatment options for you or other patients. And then after all of this, there's other things to consider, and that is that even if you decide the benefits outweigh the risks and the burden and you want to participate, each trial has their own set of eligibility criteria, and you may not end up being eligible for the study. So every eligibility criteria, so inclusion and exclusion criteria, have to be met in order to participate in a research study. And those can include things like the actual diagnosis you have, your age, your overall health, how far your disease has progressed, and your different types of treatment history. If you've already received an experimental treatment, you may not be eligible for another research study studying a different experimental treatment. And the other thing to just remember is that clinical trials are completely done on a volunteer basis. Participants basically can choose whether or not to participate, and it's completely at their own will. So this is a long list, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but take a screenshot, take a photo. I wanted to provide some questions that I think are really important to ask before you participate in a research study. And maybe, Keely, I can work with you to provide this deck as a PDF after the meeting. But hopefully you'll find this useful to discuss with your study doctor. And just to kind of highlight a few things, overall, I would ask as many questions as you have. No question is a stupid question. It is the study team's job and responsibility to go over all your questions with you. And things that you should ask is, knowing whether or not this is an interventional study or maybe an observational study. If it's a good fit for you, and your study doctor will work with you to determine that. You'll need to know how long the study is going to take, what it takes to participate, how many visits there are going to be, what your responsibilities are. whether or not there's any major risks that you should be aware of based on data that the researchers already have and know about. If there's a placebo, what are your chances of receiving placebo, and what happens if you receive placebo and then want to have access to the experimental treatment afterwards? What are all the options around that? Any type of costs and travel, out-of-pocket costs, and what are your options other than participating in this trial? That's a really great question to ask, and it's important for you to know. So after you've gone through all of that, and let's say you asked all those great questions, you got all the answers you need, and you decide you want to participate, there's something called a screening period. And that's where you go through all the different assessments to ensure that you are eligible for the study. So the list of the inclusion and exclusion criteria will be reviewed, all your medical history and information. But before all that begins, an informed consent needs to be signed. And an informed consent form is basically a document that's going to tell you everything about the study. It's going to tell you what the research is for, what you should expect as a participant, like what kinds of visits are you going to have to come in for, what type of procedures are going to be done, what are the risks and benefits, who else is participating in this study, so how many other people and where, what are the alternative treatments and procedures that are available to you, what happens to your data, information about any compensation if you participate and if any type of injury occurs, what type of injuries may occur based on data that's already available, your contacts for any types of questions you may have, and an informed consent form will always tell you that and remind you, and I know I've said this already because it's so important, but your participation is always voluntary. So that form is really important. It will tell you all this information and you're required to sign it if you decide to participate. There's another form that's called an assent form, and that's a document that also tells you or tell someone about the research that's being done, but it's written in a way that's a little bit more understandable to a younger population. And basically an assent form is for someone who is too young to provide informed consent because they're not an adult, they're not 18 plus. But we want to make sure that as a pediatric participant that they understand what they're kind of getting into and that they agree that they want to participate. So that may be something that's required for the research study that you're participating in. And overall, what I want to highlight before we go to the next slide is that informed consent is a process. It is not going to stop with that first visit where you sign this document. At any point during the research study, you should feel comfortable to share your questions and concerns with your study team. It's really key for you to feel like you know what's going on and what is being required of you. So after you sign consent, after they determine that you're eligible, you start the study. And basically you'll come in for study visits. It's determined based on each study. Each study is going to have their own set of visits. And the study team will tell you when you'll be required to come in for those visits. And you have very important responsibilities as a trial participant. So if you recall that slide I shared with you earlier about all the different phases, the importance of data, well, you are a huge part of that data. And by participating in the research, we're collecting data to go to the FDA and let them know, is this drug working? Is it safe? Is it effective? So the different information we're collecting from you is really important. So some of your responsibilities to help us with that include willingly participating in the study visits and the study tests and following the instructions that your study team provides you. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is that if you're uncomfortable with any of the assessments that are being requested, at any time. You can withdraw your participation in certain types of tests in the study. You'll have to talk with your study doctor about those things. But for instance, if you don't feel comfortable doing some blood work for one visit, it could potentially be okay with the study team for you to miss that. You just need to have a conversation with your study doctor. If there's drug that's being given, you should be taking it as instructed, and be honest with the team. If you've missed any doses, if you've accidentally taken too many doses, you should tell them, because it's so important for the team to know any information about the study drug and how you've taken it or anything like that. And other things that's really important is if you're supposed to take the drug without any food or with food and you forget to do these things, you should be writing this information down and remembering to tell your study team about this as well. It's important for you to come to the study center for the study visits during the time that you've been asked to come. So oftentimes visits will have like a window, whether it's plus or minus a couple days, a week. Your study team should tell you about this. And if you miss a visit one day, if you can try to come in during at another time during that window, that's really helpful for the research. Any side effects or adverse events that you're having or experiencing from the drug or just in general, you should be telling your study team everything. So the kind of repetitive information that I'm sharing with you here is like, be as honest as possible, be as transparent as possible with your study team. If there's anything new that you decide to take during the study, let's say you found a new vitamin that you want to take while you're participating in a research study, even that information is really important, because if something affects the data, they need to know if it was potentially because of the study drug or this additional medication or vitamins that you're taking. You probably can't participate in any other interventional trials or any other clinical trials actually while you're participating in one study, because it could affect the data that they're collecting. So this is a conversation you'll need to have with your study team, but it's likely that you will not be able to participate in multiple studies at once. It's a little bit different if you're signed up for like a registry where they're just collecting some information from you. But any type of clinical trial, you usually can only participate in one at a time. And then one other important thing that Dr. Van Haren had mentioned, and it's a great point, is just be careful about the information you're sharing with others in your support groups or in social media. And I think it's important to share your experience in clinical research with others. I think that's how we learn from each other. But I did talk about the importance of study blinding, that we don't have any bias. And if you share too much information, it can potentially affect the blinding of the data and then affect the integrity of the data and the quality of the data. So just be careful about how much information you're sharing. And if you have any questions about that, make sure you have a conversation with your study team about what kind of information you can share with others. Again, we don't want to keep you from sharing information and sharing your experience with people, but you just have to be careful with how much you share. And I've already said it multiple times, so I'm going to repeat myself again, but please be honest and transparent with your study team. Share as much information as possible with them so that they have all the information they need to report back to the study sponsor. Okay, so you've participated in the study and the study is over. What is next? So at the end of a clinical trial, typically the study team should let you know what the next steps are, whether it's, you may need to come back for some additional follow-up because they may need to look at long-term side effects and safety. They'll tell you about what kind of ongoing treatment you'll receive, and you'll continue to receive, or not treatment, but sorry, what kind of care you'll receive. And you'll always be receiving care from one of your healthcare providers, but it depends on who you're seeing for this clinical trial. You may be seeing a new study doctor who you don't normally see for your kind of routine care. So you'll have to have a conversation with them about next steps in that case. They'll talk to you about access to the drug after the study. So sometimes, depending on the study and the sponsor, there may be access to the study drug in an open label extension. So basically that's a study where they just continue to provide the experimental treatment until the drug is available on the market. And they'll still collect some safety information from you. Or there may be another study that you can participate in. So you'll have to chat with them about that. You have the right to ask if you received the study drug or placebo at the end of your participation, and they'll let you know that information, or when they can tell you that information. You'll probably want to know what the results of the study are, and you can, once it's available, you can ask them to ask the study team to explain the results to you. And as I mentioned earlier, all study results are required to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So if for any reason you lost touch with your study team, you can always look on clinicaltrials.gov for those results. Although I will tell you the timing of that sometimes can be a while. It can be months before the results are available. And then finally, you're probably interested to know what's going to happen to this treatment or this study drug that's being studied in you. And will it be approved? When is it approved? And if you kind of think back on that slide that I showed you about the different phases, if you participate earlier, so let's say in a phase 2 study, it can take multiple years for the drug to get, for that application to go into the FDA and then for the approval to come through. So it could be like 3-5 years or more. If you participate in a phase 3 study, it may be a little less, but even after the end of a phase 3 study, it can take an entire year before the drug is approved. And that's just because there's a lot of data that's being analyzed and submitted to the FDA, and the FDA needs to have enough time to assess if the drug should be approved or not. And that's why it just takes time. So I just want to end on clinical trials in rare diseases. Clinical trials in general, there's no difference in how they're conducted or any of the basic information, whether they're done in rare diseases or in more broader diseases, like let's say diabetes or things like that. But in rare diseases, there is some difference, right? We know that there's a smaller population of people who are affected by the disease. So potentially the studies have a smaller number of people that they'll allow in the research. There may be fewer clinical study sites because there's fewer experts in the disease. And overall, in rare diseases, there's just less understanding, little to no information about the disease natural history. Sometimes there's just lack of understanding of all the different outcome measures and endpoints, or as I mentioned earlier, the ways that we measure if the disease is improving or not based on study treatment. And for all of us, we probably understand that time is of the essence. And with rare diseases, there's oftentimes very few or no treatment options available. So, there is an urgency to getting a trial completed and the process done so that we can bring these treatments and make them available to patients. So to kind of go off of that, I want to end on natural history studies and talk about what they are and why they're important. And basically, again, the purpose of a natural history study is to collect data and information on how a disease or a condition progresses over time. without any type of intervention, and just what the natural course of the disease is. And it's really important for us to know about this because it helps us find the right types of patients who should participate in the interventional studies and the types of patients who may benefit from the study drug that's being developed. Natural history studies help us understand the different types of assessments and biomarkers that help measure disease progression. They could potentially save us time by replacing placebo arms in interventional studies. There may be some efficiencies that we can create based on the natural history data and potentially, I don't know, make studies shorter or just reduce the number of assessments that we do in the interventional studies. And it helps us, or natural history studies help us collect data on the disease that has occurred already in patients and that how it may be occurring in the future. And that's really important for us to know as well. And this is all very important for control data, like I mentioned earlier, and can potentially help us not have placebo arms in interventional studies. And I'm not sure if Dr. Van Haren, you've had a chance to join, but if so, if you have anything else.
I'm here with you, Angela. Yeah, sorry, we had a.
You'd like to add here?
No, I would add only, just emphasize the importance of the natural history studies in understanding essentially every element of how to counsel families in the rare disease space, understanding what to expect, and then especially in just understanding whether a trial is even possible. We really can't do clinical trials without natural history studies.
Thank you. And that is the end of my presentation. Dr. Van Haren, was there anything else that you'd like to add about your experience with clinical trials or anything that you think the participants today should know about?
Yeah, so my apologies to the group here. We had a family emergency on my end, so I'm now outside the hospital here. But we, I think the thing to, I guess I would say here is that a lot of leukodystrophies are entering a time in which clinical trials are with either beginning or within a couple years of beginning for many of the leukodystrophies. And so there's a lot of hope and a lot of interest. And I would just encourage families to stay connected with organizations like the ULF to try and keep on top of clinical trials as they begin, and to work with specialists and companies both. Companies like Vigil and others will be looking for family and patient input, you'll more than ever before, patients will have a say in designing trials, so there will be a time for you, hopefully, to share what really matters to you, and that literally will be incorporated into clinical trial designs increasingly in the future. So.
Thank you, and sorry to hear about your family emergency. I think, Keely, we're ready to open it up to any questions or clarifications that anyone would like us to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Angela. And again, sorry to hear about your family emergency, Dr. Van Haren, but thank you for hopping on, even just to be available for answering a few questions. We do have one from Christy that says, does the path look different for an approved drug that you are repurposing?
Yes. So typically when a drug is already approved, it's usually approved for another therapy. So some of these steps may be skipped a little bit. So let me just go back to that slide because that's a great question. We wouldn't need to sorry, it's dizzy. There we go. There's typically not going to be another phase 1 study because that study is done in healthy volunteers. We already have like the basic information from that study. But when you're researching a drug in a new disease, you still need to go through the process of collecting data in other phase trials because it could potentially work completely differently in that disease. So there is a little bit of efficiency, but not like a complete, like you don't need to do certain things like a phase 2 or a phase 3 study, but there may be some efficiencies there. Hopefully that answers your question, Christy.
Okay, so anyone is welcome to ask any questions. You can type them in the chat box, or at this point, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions out loud, whatever you're comfortable with and prefer.
Or was there anything that you expected to learn today that I didn't go over? Any information that you were hoping to get and maybe there wasn't enough information about it here? Or is there anything new that you learned today that was surprising to you? That would be interesting to know as well.
One of the, some of the most, there was one really great slide that you put together, Angela. And by the way, again, really, really fantastic set of slides for the leukodystrophy community. Thank you so much for putting these together. Do you mind going to your questions to ask slide? That was a really wonderful overview.
There we go.
Here we go. This is a really great slide. I think if anybody wanted kind of a single takeaway for when they're thinking about trial enrollment, this covers a lot of really great questions, and I would just encourage people to take note of this slide and then to build on it. I think among the most common questions around trial entry will be, will I get a drug or not? In other words, is there a drug involved or an intervention of some kind? And then what are the odds I'll be getting it, be assigned to it? And so is there a placebo arm? And so not all studies have a placebo arm. Not all studies have a drug. And when there is a placebo arm, the number of people who get a placebo versus the drug may vary quite a bit. So they may assign one person to drug and one person to placebo, or they may assign 3 people to the drug and 1 person to placebo. And those are things that might be of interest to know. Of course, what are the side effects of the drug be of interest, and then even if you get placebo, sometimes after the study is done, they will still allow access to the drug. And so that can be one of the advantages to enrolling in a study, even if you might get placebo for a time, that you can get access to the drug afterward before it is approved. And so in addition to the many other wonderful questions you might have, these are some key ones that we're keeping in mind.
Thank you. And I think I just thought of one thing that I did not mention is at any time during the study, of course, we would love you to continue to participate and finish the study through the end of the study. But if for any reason you need to withdraw or no longer participate, that is, as I mentioned earlier, participation is always voluntary and you can always withdraw your consent if needed. I would have a conversation with your study team about that before you do, but that's always an option for you. All All
All
right.
right, well, if there are no additional questions for our speakers, I just want to take a moment to thank Angela and Dr. Van Haren so much for the presentation today and participating this weekend. It's for our virtual family conference. I will go ahead and shut down the session, but with that being said, if for any reason you come up with a question later on, please feel free to shoot us an email at office@ulf.org. I'd be happy to pass the questions on to Angela and Dr. Van Haren and see if we could get you an answer. And Angela has put their email addresses on the screen as well. So don't feel like you've missed your chance if you came up with a question late. Please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much again, Angela and Dr. Van Haren, and thank you everyone who participated in the session today. Have a great day, and we hope to see you in person next year.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Angela, great job. Sorry for coming in late.
No worries.
I can explain another time, but I appreciate all the work you did on this. It was really awesome.
No problem. I hope everything's okay, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Take care.